Hello and season's greetings. My name is J.R. Park. I am a author of horror fiction. You may have heard of me, you may or not. I guess it just depends how lucky you are. Today, as is tradition, I will be reading a ghost story over the Christmas period. And today's story is written by an excellent author by the name of John McNee. The story is called Living is a Lonely Business. So pull up a seat. Try not to burn your eyes out on the Christmas tree. And let's begin. In the world's great pantheon of tragic figures, few can compare to the image of a lone woman searching for a missing cat. There are, of course, far greater traumas one can endure than the loss of a beloved pet. But this is part and parcel to the cruel nature of the ordeal. Society makes allowances for those who have lost a partner or parent. Support is offered through rituals and processes. Communities will rally behind the hunt for a missing child, but the search for a lost cat is more typically one that must be conducted alone. The fear, worry and grief must be endured alone. So too must the agonising flame of hope. Few, if any, can truly understand the nature of the bond that exists between a particular animal and their owner, nor can it be effectively articulated without sounding entirely fanciful or even perverse. All one can endeavour to do is empathise. Paul empathised with Carol. At least he thought he did. He'd never met her, but he watched her from the window of his flat as he wove her way through his neighbours' gardens, searching behind plant pots and under cars. He listened with a compassionate ear to her plaintive cries of, "Zuza! Where are you, Zuza?" getting louder as she approached his building, fading away as she moved up on the street. He felt overwhelming sadness the following day to see her going from door to door, lamppost to lamppost, posting pictures of the cat in question. "Missing," read the text above the indifferent feline's face. "Have you seen Zuza? She is 10 years old with orange stripes and a pink mark on her nose. She is microchipped and wearing a green collar. Very lovely and friendly. Loves people and food and will come if called. I really miss her and want her back home safe." Beneath, in bold capital letters, was the message, "If seen, call Carol on," and her phone number. Paul's heart positively broke every time he read the poster, which was often. There was one taped to the front door of his building, and he found himself studying it every time he went out and every time he returned. He couldn't help passing an eye over each of its comrades on the lampposts and railings lining his route to and from the shops. It was a mild form of torture to be constantly reminded of Carol's futile search, her pain and her pitiful optimism in believing little Zuza might yet return. But time and weather take their toll, and so, after a few days, all the posters had been blown, washed, or torn away. Even the one on Paul's front door, and so for a brief period he forgot all about it, until one morning he turned from his desk to see Carol morosely winding her way up the street, a stack of freshly printed posters in one hand and a roll of tape in the other. He watched her as she worked, her face a mask of steely determination, albeit puffy around the eyes. By the time she was done, she had redecorated his whole neighbourhood. She played on his mind a lot after that. He wondered how such a woman, still young, not unattractive, obviously caring and possessed of a strong character, should find herself so isolated and utterly bereft without the companionship of an almost certainly apathetic creature. She played on his mind a lot after that. He wondered how such a woman, still young, not unattractive, obviously caring and possessed of a strong character, should find herself so isolated and utterly bereft without the companionship of an almost certainly apathetic creature. He knew it was presumptuous to imagine her world was as empty as his own, but there was evidence to be deduced from her behaviour, in the message she'd posted. I really miss her and I want her back home safe. The sentiment alone was heartbreaking, a sentiment of such naked vulnerability. He couldn't imagine ever being so bold as to put it into writing. But the most crucial word was I, not we. There was no one else back home for Zuzu to come back to. Only Carol. Paul wanted to talk to her. He felt instinctively that they had a lot in common, and he knew her name and number, which was more than he could say for any of the other women who passed beneath the window of his silent room. But any conversation was certain to be brief. Her poster was not an invitation to courtship. Any attempt he made to engage her in polite chit-chat would surely not be kindly received. There was only one subject she cared to discuss with him or any other strange man who called from an unknown number. The cat. The cat was his only hope of forging a connection, his only chance of getting a foot in the door. But it wouldn't be enough just to say he'd seen it. Not even enough to say that it was dead. The only thing that might be strong enough to serve as the foundation on which a friendship, more, might be built, was to say her cat was alive and well and safe in his care. And of course, he would never say such a thing unless it was true. In quiet moments, of which he experienced a great many, Paul couldn't help but fantasize about finding the cat, being the hero of the hour. He imagined how he might deliver the news, how it might be received, how things might proceed from there. A flight of fancy that warmed his heart whenever he indulged in it, but nothing more than a dream. Until, one dark and frigid evening, in the depth of winter, when he ventured out into the alley behind his building, taking a bag of rubbish to the bins, and there she was. The spit of a picture, orange stripes, and a pink mark on her nose, wearing a green collar, exactly as the poster had described. Zuzu. Paul stared at her, disbelieving, and she stared right back, her eyes wide round in gold, the breath from her gentle purrs misting in the December air. They were perhaps 4 feet apart, her watching him from atop the brick wall behind the bins. He crept forward and she moved away, taking only a few steps along the ridge before settling again. And Paul was afraid to make another move, afraid to breathe. He felt his heart racing as he watched the cat willing her into his arms, but without a clue how to make such a thing happen. Gently, he placed his rubbish bag to the ground, crouched down, instinctively aping the mannerisms of an animal striking its prey, and once more attempted to close the distance between them. Again, Zuzu moved away, only this time she didn't stop. She continued to pad along the top of the wall, unhurried, appearing to take no notice of Paul whatsoever. He followed after her, feeling like a fool, imagining how ridiculous he must look. He'd come out of the flat in his slippers, without a coat, his wallet or phone, only planning to be a minute. He wished he could call Carol, tell her what was happening. But he would have to go back to do that, and to tell her the cat had been seen, well, it might please her, but it wouldn't do him any great favours. She had to be in his hands. They left the alley, crossed the street, and entered the local play park, Zuzu's pace quickening along the way. By the time they left the park and had crossed another street, Paul realised he was running. He was forced to stop to catch his breath, and she stopped too. He stood bent over, hungrily sucking lungfuls of freezing air down his throat and watching her. She licked her paws and stared back. He crouched down, stretching out his arm and rubbing his fingers like they held a treat, calling her name and making kissing sounds. She only stared back, thoroughly unimpressed. It felt almost like he was being mocked. To hell with it, he thought, and turned away. He was no natural-born cat catcher. The pursuit felt foolish and futile. He was halfway across the street, his mind already on tea and biscuits and books back in the warmth of his living room, when the softest of meows brought him to a halt. He turned to find Zuza creeping towards him, calling to him in a feline way. He was afraid to move in case he scared her off, but she weaved away between his legs, nuzzling her head at his knee. Slowly, he squatted down and reached out his hand, stroking it along her back. She purred and pulled in closer to him, eyes blinking shut, an apparent display of trust. He rubbed a knuckle under her chin, scratched behind her ear, and slid both hands beneath her body and tried to pick her up. She slid from his grasp like liquid and was away again, back on the pavement, moving up the street. He stood and went after her. The chase continued in that vein for some distance. Zuza led him across the streets, over hills, in and out of gardens, and across waste ground. Each time he lost his faith and decided to turn back, she would go to him, wrap herself around his legs, and convince him he could carry her all the way back home, before slipping through his hands when he made a fumbling attempt to lift her. Paul would glance around, expecting to hear the laughter of strangers who had stopped to watch this comical figure pursuing a cat across the city. But the night was black and the streets were empty, and there was nobody around to see. At last, they came to the end of a street Paul had never been down before, arriving at the gate to a house half hidden by overgrown trees. The gate was broken, but secured to its spiked rails was a sheet of paper and a plastic cover on which were printed details of a planning application and intention to demolish. Paul peered up the house, squinting past the tangled net of barren branches to see a narrow stone property looming tall and lopsided, its edifice cold and dead as a gravestone, its windows boarded up and its front door standing open. When he glanced back down, he saw Zuza halfway up the crooked path to the porch. He called to her, made every pleading sound and gesture he could, but she would not be dissuaded. He watched helplessly as she danced up the steps and disappeared inside, swallowed by the darkness. This then was it, he thought. He'd come as far as he dared. Time to admit defeat and trudge the lonesome trail back home. But what did he have to go home to? A night spent lying awake, cursing himself for his cowardice, for throwing away a chance at making something worth living for finally happen in his life. He wasn't a pure fantasist. He knew even if he showed up at Carol's door with her cat in his arms, there was no guarantee it would lead to anything more than her thanks. Yet fortune favours the bold. Why can't you be bold? He asked himself. Be bold. He squeezed through the broken gate and strode quickly up the path, firm in his resolve, only once glancing back to make sure no neighbours had seen him trespass. There was no cause for concern. The grey trees obscured everything of the street beyond. He crept up the steps and inside the house, the shadows closing around him the way they had the cat. It was colder in its holes than outside, but he pressed on with purpose, eyes searching the darkness for signs of Zuza. He called her name and was answered by a shrill meow from up ahead. Then he rounded a corner and found himself standing in an open doorway. The room beyond was small and windowless, lit only by the dim glow of a log fire. A tattered armchair stood in the middle of the floor, angled towards the hearth. Against the wall was a single bed. Sitting on it, almost imperceptible in the gloom, was an old woman. Hush now, hush. Her voice was as thin and cracked as parchment paper. There's no need to get upset. Only the outline of a narrow frame and wiry grey hair was visible in the firelight, her eyes and face concealed by shadow. When she spoke, Paul thought she was addressing him, but then he saw the gentle movement of a jagged elbow and realised she was talking to the cat. Zuza nestled snug in her lap, her curling tail lit intermittently by the dwindling flames. the woman's clawed fingers raking rhythmically down her spine. They don't deserve their reputation, you know. Now Paul was certain she spoke to him. Least of all this one. People talk of cats as selfish, uncaring creatures, but nothing could be further from the truth. She's the most sensitive and affectionate little darling I ever met, with a talent for sniffing out the lost, the lonely and the broken-hearted. She found me easily enough, rattling around in this big old house, growing older, sicker and more decrepit by the day. Nothing but cobwebs for company. She used to visit me a few times a week. Back when I lived here, so concerned was she for my general well-being. Now she's scared to leave me for as much as a moment, so afraid of what might become of me, all alone and forgotten by the world. It's a pitiful existence with nobody by your side. She was silent for several moments, and in that time the air was filled only with the sound of Zuza's low purrs, the crackle of the flames, and Paul's hammering heart. He remained poised in the doorway, afraid to move, afraid to speak, but unsure of exactly why. Attempting to reassert some control over his body, he swallowed, took a breath, and opened his mouth. The woman spoke instead. I think she'd stay forever if I asked her to, but I never would. And she knows fine well that in the long term, a cat is a poor companion for a person. It's not enough just to have something to talk to. You need someone who can, at the very least, talk back. Her arm ceased its clockwork movement and she sighed. That's enough now, little one. Time for you to stop fussing over me and go back home, where you belong. Finally, regaining his composure, Paul managed to clear his throat as he stepped into the room. Yes, I can take her, he said. I can take her back to her owner. He moved towards the pair of shadows huddled on the bed, crouching down to encourage Zuza into his arms. He saw her jump. In the same moment, the woman let out another sigh, louder and longer, and more agonized than the last. Oh, living is a lonely business. Her voice sounded distant and unbearably close all at once, but it's nothing compared to what comes after. For the most fleeting moments, Paul could feel the cat in his hands, her silken hair brushing against his fingertips. But then she was through his grasp, slipping between his legs and dashing out of the room. He wheeled unsteadily around to catch her, flailing with his grasping fists and catching the edge of the door by mistake. It slammed hard, like his arms had the weight of a sledgehammer behind it. He stepped up to it, reached for the handle, but gripped only air. His hands roved over the door's smooth surface, but found it had been stripped of anything that would give him purchase. It was sealed tight, not a sliver of a gap around the frame. He pounded upon it, but could not get it to move a fraction of an inch. He turned and strode towards the woman on the bed, stumbling when he saw the shadows he'd mistaken for a human form dissemble into nothing more than creases in the fabric of the bedding, a dark and swelling stain on the wallpaper. His eyes searched the gloom, confirming what he already knew. There was no woman. He was alone, in a sealed room, in an empty house. In a panic, he screamed for help. He threw himself to the floor and crawled up and down its bare boards, hunting for a loose edge or a discarded tool. He kicked at the bed frame, hoping to break off a sharp edge he could use as a weapon against the door. He pored over every inch of the four walls, raking them with his house keys, searching for any weakness he might exploit, anywhere he might be able to break free. There was nothing. And so he returned to the door, hurling himself against it again and again till his whole body was numb from the pain and black with bruises. and not so much as a dent in the wood. And all throughout he screamed, howling for help, fully aware there was no one to hear him. He screamed until his voice broke and became a strained, harrowed wheeze. And from then on, all he could do was weep. At long last, exhausted, hopeless and bereft of ideas, he collapsed into the armchair by the fireplace. And in the moments before the final embers flickered their last and plunged him into darkness, he wondered how many days, weeks, or months it would be before anybody went looking for him.